Okay, so I'm going to ask our panelists for the Alternatives to Incarceration panel to come to the stage. And while you all are coming to the stage, I just wanted to make one announcement. Well, actually, I have a few, but they'll be going on later on in the conference also. There's a report outside the door that was provided by Ken Barnes, who was mentioned earlier, and it's a survey of mental health courts in Louisiana, mental health criminal justice disparities, and a review of Judge Leifman's program. So there's been some cross-pollination between Miami-Dade County Mental Health Project run by Judge Stephen Leifman and our parish and state. And I'm really excited that Cindy Schwartz, who is here from Miami-Dade, is the program director for the pre- and post-jail booking diversion programs under Judge Stephen Leifman, who is going to be speaking a little bit about that. We have also Barksdale Hortenstine, our own Orleans public defender, who really was instrumental in beginning the mental health unit at OPD. And we have Cheryl Roberts, who I mentioned earlier, from the Greenburger Center in New York that do an amazing amount of advocacy and research and have a focus on decriminalizing mental illness. And Tracy Davillier Flemings, Tracy Flemings-Davillier, sorry, got the marital names mixed up, but with our criminal justice court here in New Orleans also, who has been working on some exciting things. So the way that we're going to do this is everybody will have a chance to speak for 7 minutes, and I'm going to be strict because we want to keep as close to the time as possible, to let you know about something that they've done to implement a policy of service or a program that's working in their county or their parish. And then we're going to get into moderated questions. So Cindy, you want to, I think it's Cecile. If Cecile Tebo is here, she was also going to be on the panel. And I'm not sure if she's going to make it or not, but Cindy, take it away.
So can we have more than 7 minutes?
No, 7 minutes, that's all you get. But we're going to get into it in moderated questions so you can talk more then.
Okay, I need to tell you folks that I usually do this presentation in 2 days, 1 day, a half a day, an hour, a half an hour, never 7 minutes. So bear with me, I'm going to probably talk very fast. Thank you, Janet, for inviting me to New Orleans. We've been having a great time here. I want to provide greetings to you from Judge Leifman. He's very sorry that he couldn't be here today. But I want to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Cindy Schwartz, and I'm the project director for the 11th Judicial Circuit Criminal Mental Health Project Jail Diversion Programs. So that's a real mouthful, and let me tell you that my job is really very comprehensive. I work for the courts. Judge Leifman has been our champion, and this program is his vision. He started the program in the year 2000. I joined him in 2003 as a result of a SAMHSA grant, a Targeted Capacity Expansion grant. I was working in the community before that as a mental health professional, and I've got to tell you, when I ended up in the courts, I didn't know what to do. I mean, it was a very different experience. Working for the courts is and learning the whole criminal justice system is a whole different ball game and very different from behavioral health. I'm very happy to tell you that 16 years later, we've been able to develop a very comprehensive program. It's a jail diversion program, not a mental health court. And our program has two specific components. The first component is pre-booking diversion, and we work along with all 36 police municipalities in Miami-Dade County to provide crisis intervention team training. To date, we have trained more than 7,000 police officers, which has helped to change the values of police officers towards people with mental illnesses. We also have a very active police mental health collaboration, which began as part of a Bureau of Justice assistance planning grant, and if you can apply for that planning grant, I would encourage you to do that. It was really a learning experience, and the result of that grant was writing a strategic plan to develop more collaborative relationships with all stakeholders in the community. The second component of our program is our post-booking diversion program. And eligibility for that program is that a person must have a serious mental illness, something like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder. We also are including PTSD. The legal criteria for admission to our program is different depending on which program that you may enter into. We have a jail in-reach program, which is an active collaboration with the Miami-Dade Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, Correctional Health Services, which is run by the Public Health Trust, Jackson Health Systems, the Mental Health Authority in Miami-Dade County, and the courts. Without these active collaborations, I don't think that we would be as successful as we are today. But the goal of the Jail In-Reach program is to identify people as they're entering our jails. So screening begins at booking in the jail and goes through a whole series of screenings and assessments. Once a person is determined to be eligible for our program, we will do an assessment to determine their criminogenic risks and needs and develop an APIC plan, assess, plan, identify, and coordinate for transition to the community. So everyone that enters our program is assessed for criminogenic risk and need, and an individualized plan is put in place. We have a misdemeanor jail diversion program, and what I need to tell you is that people with serious mental illnesses are represented and eligible in that program. We see more people in our misdemeanor program that are disabled by their mental illnesses. We also have a felony program. Oh, and I need to tell you that for misdemeanors, we take anybody in terms of their legal charges, except for traffic violations, because there's state mandates about that. Our felony program, again, you need to have a serious mental illness, and legal charges are eligible if it's a third-degree felony offense, which are lower-level felonies, or a second degree, but all participants must be approved by the state attorney. Both our misdemeanor program and our felony program are pre-adjudication. When people enter and voluntarily agree to participate in our programs, their charges are held open until they successfully complete the program. For misdemeanors, it's about 3, 6, or 9 months. For felonies, it's a minimum of 1 year. So people are monitored during their time in the program to ensure that they are meeting the conditions of their diversion from jail. Our goal is to decriminalize mental illnesses. And of course, our mission is to make jail the last resort. We also have a forensic diversion program, people that are found incompetent to proceed. There's a pilot project. I can talk all day about that, and if you have other questions, feel free to ask me. Florida is not a Medicaid expansion state, so we have an entitlement unit where we assist people to apply for Social Security benefits. You may know that across all disabilities, only 27% get approved on the initial application. Our program has a 90% approval rate in 40 days. We know how to do it right the first time. And this is a tool in recovery. It helps the person served as well as maximizing the limited funding that we have for our program. The other thing that I need to tell you about is that we have peer specialists that help us to engage the people served in our program. This is really one of the secrets of our success. Before we had peer specialists, we would go through all the steps needed to help a person transition to the community, and they would get out into the community with housing and treatment ready for their journey to recovery, and they would run away in the first 5 minutes. What we have found by using peer specialists is that the peer specialists develop a relationship with the people that are involved in our program, and it's that relationship that makes a difference. We have 6 part-time peer specialists and 2 full-time peer specialists. I think we have more peer specialists that work within our program than anywhere else in our community.
So, Cindy, I'm just going to interrupt, and we can get back to that during the moderated questions, because I'm going to be asking you questions specific to that. But I wanted to introduce Cecile Tebo, who is a long-time, no one in our community, Cecile needs no introduction, but I'm going to get Cecile to introduce herself and talk about something that has been implemented in New Orleans that is working to bridge the gaps in the mental health crisis that we find ourselves in. And so you got 7 minutes, and then we'll come back around. I know.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, we wanted to leave time for audience questions and comments.
Did I do it in 7 minutes?
Yeah. No, but Miami-Dade's got it going on. Right? I want to hear more. Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. It was a little tricky getting down here, right? I came in from the quarter, which was just crazy. Some hard times. I've actually been handling the situation at Hard Rock. We have a police officer's fiance who was one of the victims. So it's been kind of a hard time talking about mental health, right? So I am currently the director of the NOPD Officer Assistance Program. Prior to that, I was the administrator for the NOPD Crisis Unit, which is a mobile volunteer program that was put in place 35 years ago to assist those on the streets that the police were encountering that had mental illness. And it's kind of fascinating because the sergeant, who is now, I want to say 87.
Yeah.
But back in the day, NOPD and EMS were under the same umbrella. And he started to see an increase of calls for service involving people with mental illness, and he started seeing an increase in people getting hurt. And so he had a friend of his that was a social worker, and they started this kind of volunteer mobile crisis unit, kind of just out there on the weekends. And it ended up being such an important program that it was expanded. So I actually joined the police department in the reserves and went over and volunteered with the crisis unit and then became administrator and stayed on for 10 years. One of the most fascinating things for me, being a New Orleanian, I'm 7th generation New Orleanian, was living sort of this uptown life, and all of a sudden I entered this department working in the crisis unit, and I would tell people in the morning I would suit up and put on my uniform, and it was as if I would get in an elevator, and the elevator would go down, 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 and the doors would open to the darkness and really the bowels of our city. And I was amazed and shocked at how many folks we have living here in the shadows of our great city who are so incredibly sick and who have been so neglected in care. So I did that for 10 years. I then retired and went to work for Nami, National Alliance on Mental Illness, which was awesome. Our Nami here is a service provider. Nami National is really an advocacy group for folks with mental illness. And so I went and worked with them for 4 years, which was awesome because I could actually see people getting well. When you're out on the streets working, you're not seeing people get well, and you're often seeing the same person over and over and over and over again, meaning our interactions were just coming with very little return for the individual. But when I went to work for Nami, which has a program where all the protocols for wellness are in place, I kind of equated to, I always say if I got cancer, I would probably go to MD Anderson like a lot of folks do, right? You get the diagnosis, you get your treatment protocols, and you come back into the community, right? And get those treatment protocols. But if I were to come back to my community here and my protocols were chemo and radiation, and my community said, oh, we no longer provide chemotherapy, but you can get the radiation, the chances of my survival are going to greatly diminish, right? So for those with chronic mental illness, the protocols are really your housing, case management, psychiatric care, psychiatric beds, and your outpatient clinics. So with NAMI, all of that was under one umbrella, and you could see how people could achieve much more wellness. Unfortunately, we were only able to handle maybe 150 people because financially we couldn't afford to provide for more. And that's really what this all comes down to. So anyway, I came back to NOPD to start a wellness program for the officers, which has been amazing. But I also was able to start our CIT program, which was really my baby in the first place. So CIT is a nationally recognized training program for officers in dealing with those with chronic mental illness. Our officers go through a 40-hour training. It's super intensive. And once they're certified, we give them a groovy little CIT pin to identify them, but then they become the first responder for those 911 calls. Here in New Orleans, we are averaging 20 mental health calls a day through the 911 system. We will top out this year at about 7,000 calls. So in essence, our police officers are having more encounters with those with chronic mental illness than they are having with their psychiatrists, caseworkers, clinicians, right? And so I always like to give just a quick historical perspective as to how did mental illness become criminalized, because basically that's what we have done. Our jail here in New Orleans hosts our largest number of mental health beds for the chronically mentally ill. And the city is looking at spending $99 million to build a state-of-the-art mental health hospital in the jail. And the argument is, if we had that on the outside, right, people wouldn't have to be arrested to get treatment. But unfortunately, so in 1958 is when we had the closure of all the state psychiatric hospitals around the country. It was a bipartisan, didn't happen very much, right? But this was a bipartisan, very humanitarian decision because of what was happening behind those walls. Some of you all may remember the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest with Jack Nicholson, right? Which was a great depiction of what was happening. So the doctor who started this movement actually came out and said, my God, I never wanted the facilities to close. We need those facilities. I was just demanding that there be treatment inside. But the response, our governmental response, was a complete closure. So what happened across the country is they never developed the wealth of protocols and community-based resources to meet the needs of those with chronic mental illness. Today, we have the exact same number of chronically mentally ill incarcerated as we had institutionalized in 1958. And so that's what happened, and that's why we are in this situation today. Our police officers, they're not choosing to be a police officer to be a psychiatric technician, right? But in essence, that is what they have had to become in order to meet the needs of our ever-growing, chronically mentally ill, living out in our streets, living in the shadows, living in the bowels of our city.
Thank you, Cecile.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And we'll get back. We're coming back around. We're coming back around. Barksdale, why don't you take so what happens when a person with mental illness is arrested? Tell people what you do.
Okay. Relying on the criminal justice system to manage mental health is neither just nor healthy. It's also not sound fiscal policy. My name is Barksdale Hortenstine. I'm the senior attorney for mental health at Orleans Parish Public Defender. I've been with the Public Defender's Office for 12 years. A lot of things happen when a person gets arrested, and a lot of those things are collateral to the arrest. But when a person gets arrested and they're brought to jail and they get processed through or get diverted to the hospital until they're stabilized enough to be taken to jail and processed through, they then have their first appearance where a judge will see them and speak to them for the first time. And that judge or commissioner will set bond and find probable cause to the charge that is the reason that the person is there that day. All too often, that charge is in fact a mental health stigmatization and acting out at the worst, and many times literally just a symptom of mental illness that has become criminalized, which I hope I'll get a chance to talk about later. Having done this work for 12 years, several years ago, a project was started by the Equitas Foundation. They brought together about 70 public defenders from 22 states and DC, and the point of the conference was to try to find possible solutions to the mental health crisis in the criminal justice system. And they came with a number of suggestions. I don't have time to go through them all, but the ones that are most relevant to my work is in the area of public defense, they talk of enhancing the following: to create best practice guide for client-centered representation for people with mental illness, to train defense attorneys to navigate and manage relationships, to train specialized mental health defenders to represent persons with mental illness, to increase funding and require cases with mental health issues that the public defender representing them has training in mental health issues, has a team including a social worker, a mental health professional, and an investigator who are trained in mental health issues, and to develop a public narrative around the importance and economic value of a well-funded public defender system for increased mental health outcomes for persons involved in criminal justice. I was able to rely on these recommendations internally in my office to insist that we create the position that I hold, mental health litigation, the senior attorney for mental health litigation, in hopes of being able to create a mental health unit, of which I would very much like to be the director. Progress towards that goal has been challenging. We have succeeded in getting a funded program through a grant for one mental health social worker. However, due to the nature of the application and the grant, only 50% of her work can be for my mental health unit. We put forward a proposal that Council Member Jason Williams supported and put forward to create a mental health unit solely for municipal court, as was spoken earlier about the presence of seriously mentally ill clients. The city will refer to them often as frequent flyers. I refer to my clients as long-term clients, but clients who will re-enter the system repeatedly. Robin knows a lot about that. And those persons cost our city an inordinate amount of money, but what we're doing with them is cycling them to hospitals and jail to get tranquilized and released from the hospital, to get seen for one court appearance and released with a subpoena to return. And we're asking people that are in a state of mind that is not conducive to normal actions that we take for granted, and we're asking them to behave like the persons that created the system. And it's not going to happen. If you give a person in an acute psychotic state a slip of paper for their meds and a slip of paper for the next doctor appointment as they're exiting the door, that is not going to be sufficient to get that person to that appointment or to get that person those medications. And in my practice, we find that my clients with serious mental illness who come to the jail, get processed out, and leave are not going to make that next appointment. Now, we've tried to implement several systems, a text message system, but many of my clients don't have phones, can't keep the phones that they get. The challenges are great, and the possibilities are there for solutions in evidence-based, practical solutions that are fiscally responsible. So what we've tried very hard is to develop programs around that. I wish I had an implementation story to share.
The mental health unit's a good one.
But it's not implemented, and it needs to be. And it can be, but it requires funding. And it requires a mindset shift in politicians and in the public that the embedded costs that aren't seen but are embedded in the criminal justice system as being tough on crime are actually costs that need to be attributed to healthcare, particularly mental health care and education, to prevent the need for that criminal justice system number. But those costs are hidden. That number is inside the budget for the NOPD. That number is inside the budget for the district attorney or for the judges and the portion of a budget that we receive from the city. That number were to be withdrawn and demonstrated, and half of it applied to services, it wouldn't be required. So that's what we're hoping to be able to demonstrate, that it's not only for the human being, but for the fiscal sense it makes to spend the money on that person's wellness and health.
Thank you. Next up is Cheryl Roberts, and Cheryl, I'm going to give you the remote. If you can figure it out, great. If not, just let me know when you want me to advance your slide.
Okay, well, I'm technically challenged, but so I'll try this. Let me start my timer so I know what's happening.
I am too.
So thanks for having me here. It's really a pleasure and an honor. See, I'm told you I'm technically challenged. Is that better? Yeah, okay. Just one quick thing before I talk about the Greenburger Center. I have to correct you, Janet. I'm certainly not responsible or a leader on closing Rikers. There are about 175 groups who have been active on closing Rikers, and Glenn Martin is the one who really was his brainchild. So, and in some sense, purposely so, what we want to do is focus exclusively really on the serious mentally ill or people with serious mental illness, the SMI population. So there's so many issues with closing Rikers, we keep narrowing it down. And interestingly enough, Glenn Martin said to me recently, you know, I didn't see it. I didn't see that it's the SMI population that's left, because now as we're shrinking down, and terrifically so, the population, what is left is a population that has serious mental illness and substance use disorders and higher level charges. So 50% of the people on Rikers are they're on indicted felonies. So unless you deal with that population, we're not going to close as many jails as we need to. So having said that, the Greenberger Center was formed in 2014. It was formed because Francis Greenberger's oldest son, Morgan, has SMI and engaged in activity that wound up being charged as 2 felonies. Very quickly, Morgan was out in the street. His father was a wealthy real estate developer, but Morgan didn't have cash in his pocket at the time. And he met a new friend on the street. They decided to go uptown. He robbed a cab. He was out on bail and became paranoid because he has a substance use disorder as well. And he called the police to help him because he thought a drug dealer was after him. The police came in and they immediately saw his African-American caregiver and her Hispanic friend, and they assumed that they were the drug dealers. And they put them in handcuffs. They went upstairs. They realized what they had done. The police came down, unhandcuffed his caregiver, and left. They were understandably downstairs upset. Morgan was upstairs, and he decided, you know, if the police can't help me, the firemen can help me. So he took some trash, he started a fire on his stove, watched it burn, called the fire department. They came and arrested him for arson. And when they said, did you know someone was in the house? He said, yes, my caregivers are, my friends are downstairs. It became a violent arson. So the DA and judge at that point would not divert him, and I was a former judge. I get some of it, and the reason really it comes down to if they would have diverted Morgan to a place that actually was willing to take him, if Morgan decided to leave, he would leave, and there was no way for that provider to stop him. The provider would have to go to the court and get a bench warrant, and then the police would eventually pick Morgan up, or people like Morgan, and typically that happens because they engage in other criminal activity. And so Morgan ended up taking a plea to 5 years. He spent 2.5 years on Rikers. All the stories about Rikers are true, violent place, and then 2 years upstate. Francis Greenberger and I decided to start the Greenburger Center to help other people's children. And we wanted to do two things: advocate on behalf of SMI population and also develop a new kind of model that would help people like Morgan Greenberger. So I told you I couldn't do this. Oh. So there's Francis and Morgan while he was incarcerated. So we wanted to find a place where you could get treatment, longer-term treatment, and not have the issue of what do you do if someone wants to leave. Have it voluntary, but also secure. So I thought about places like, or things like, in the federal system, wealthy people can often be diverted until their trial if they have a security guard outside their apartment door. We also looked at a Vera Institute model that used bond agency authority for misdemeanors. So they would bail people out, and then they would say, I'm the bond agent. If you don't go to your program, if you don't do what the court says, I'm going to take you into custody and bring you back. So I became a bond agent. I also bail out people for Community Bail Fund upstate New York, where I live, so we could put together this it's called Hope House on Crotona Park, this Hope House model. So this is the way Hope House works, very quickly. I have a few minutes, 2 minutes. If you have SMI and a felony level charge, if you can go anywhere else, you should go. But if you can't go anywhere else and you have a higher level felony charge, violent felony too, and you are competent to understand what's happening, and you voluntarily agree to go to Hope House, we would say and everyone agrees, we would say to the judge, post bail on this person. $100, it doesn't matter. I'll post the bail. Greenberger Center will post the bail. I'm the bond agent. We then take this person out of jail, incarceration under conditions. They're going to go to Hope House. They're going to stay at Hope House. They're not going to leave. They're going to not be violent, and they're going to participate in our program for up to 2 years. If they get there and they decide to leave, I hate it. I'd rather go back to prison. The bond agent can take them back, and there's no bench warrant needed. So we reduce that lag time to make judges and DAs more comfortable with the fact that this is voluntary, but if they don't want to be here, they don't have to be here. Also, if they become violent or fail out of the program, then we can take them back on the spot. So we will have 24-hour security there. In the background, they're not, and like the good cop kind of model, not COs, and not that COs are all, bad. They're not. I've met a lot that are terrific. And they'll have clinical staff during the day and residential folks at night. So we have gotten tremendous support from DAs, judges, victims' rights advocacy organizations. And I'll end with I'm most proud. I used to be an environmental and land use lawyer, municipal lawyer. We bought 2 properties in the Bronx. Oh, God. Wait. Okay, these 2 properties in the Bronx. One was a shelter, one was a privately owned. We bought them, and this is what we want to turn it into. It was going too well. So that's hopefully Hope House. We went to the community board, and we said, before we went to any elected officials, we said, okay, we bought these properties. We want to have people with SMI on felony level charges in your community. What do you say? If you don't want us here, we'll leave. They said, no, let's have a conversation. 8 months of conversation. They said in the end, we want 2 things from you. No sex offenders, because next door is an after-school day program. I said, I get it, okay. And we want 6 beds reserved for people from the Bronx, because they get it. The Bronx has the highest incarceration rate in the city. And I literally was in tears. I thought, God, thank you. So they have been an incredible host. The problem has not been the community. The problem has been government regulation on the state, federal level the building department, and raising the money for it. So we're getting close. We're almost there with Medicaid. The building department has been a challenge, but I think we're almost through it, that process, and we hope to break ground in the spring. So I'm happy to answer any questions. And one thing I do want to address in the question and answer is what you all are doing here to create a jail for people with SMI and what they've been doing in New York. It's the wrong way to go, the wrong way to go. We should not feel good about creating a jail for people with SMI.
Thank you so much. And now, and by the way, we're going to have another round. We all get 5 minutes to talk about it. I'm going to ask you a question before audience participation. But yeah, Tracy Flemings-Davillier. I love Tracy. A few of you may know me from going to meetings and being the disruptor in the room. And so one day I went to this criminal justice meeting, and Tracy's on the committee, and I was talking about the fact that the criminal justice committee was not collaborative enough and not involving the New Orleans Health Department and our behavioral health agency, and that if we're going to plan to depopulate our jails, that we have to have the health department at the planning table, and I never see the health department. And so anyway, so Tracy was there and she was on the committee, and I'm in the audience, and she looked over at me and she said, "Do you want to talk about this?" And so I took her up on her offer. We had a great meeting, and I wanted to put that out there, because there are some people in the community who are real decision makers who will listen. I mean, who are anxious and thirsty for information, coming from advocates like our organization, but advocates like you all as well. So, Tracy, I'm sorry, I wasted time. I didn't waste your time. You got 7 minutes. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tracy Flemings-Davillier. I'm a judge in criminal district court. I'll just give you just a little background. I'm born and raised here in New Orleans, and I worked for a corporate law firm for about 15 years, doing a lot of insurance, defense, and products liability work. Got involved in basically the juvenile justice system, representing foster kids who were either abused or neglected in what we called our child in need of care programs, while I was working at the firm. And so that's how I got involved in this system. Eventually became a juvenile court judge, worked there for 3 years. And as a juvenile court judge, worked on a program under SAMHSA for the coordinated system of care, trying to develop a program for our youth who were suffering from mental illness and other issues that warranted care outside of the juvenile justice system. Eventually, I became a criminal district court judge in 2013. Been there for 7 years. I've been on the bench for about 10 years. I am the Court Intervention Services Judicial Liaison. So when I got to criminal district court, there were a number of programs that were running, but they were running based on various supervisors, directors, whoever was involved or hired to work on that particular program. And so what I asked the judges is if they would create what we call an umbrella program over all of the court programs. And so we created Court Intervention Services, which we call CIS. Because I have a sociology degree, I feel like it's my duty to use what I've learned in sociology, what I've learned over the years, as well as my law degree, sort of to balance the both. So it's not just about law and order, it's about what do I do for those people that come before the court system. So to be clear, I firmly believe that the court system, the jail system is not the place to address mental illness. I firmly believe that. However, on a daily basis, that is what me and my colleagues are presented with. So what do? We have had many people say, look, court is not a social services agency. You guys shouldn't be doing all of this. And we get it. But when they come before us, it is our duty and our responsibility to demand that we do something within the authority and the control that's given to us by the state legislature and by the laws that exist. And to also work with the wonderful advocates, all the people who are involved in the social services, who are actually the experts and professionals in that particular field, to try to make our systems more accountable and more responsible to those that come before the system. So we have several different systems that work. Basically, when a person is arrested, as Barksdale said, they come into our system. We have a new pretrial services system that's been in existence for a couple of years now. And at that point, everyone is pretty much assessed. At this point, the assessments are just for risk of future criminal offenses or failure to appear. What we are hoping is that eventually those assessments will also involve some type of screening for mental health or mental illness so that we can do some type of diversion. At this point in time, Louisiana law does not allow judges to develop diversion or to divert anyone to a particular program. That's left up to the district attorney's office. So we're hoping that over time, we can work with the district attorney's office to develop that diversion program pre-acceptance, so before any actual formal charges are filed. Right now, that's not the case. Right now, at this point, there's pre-acceptance. The district attorney's office reviews the case, and if they decide to accept a case, a bill of information is filed or the person is indicted. Those persons do go before, we have 4 commissioners that work in the evenings and on weekends, as well as a magistrate judge who is elected and who works during the day. If there is some information that either the commissioners or the magistrate judge develops or finds out that indicates that a person has a particular mental health need, they can do referrals at that particular time as a part of their bond obligations in order to get that person into treatment. Once a case is accepted and it comes before me or one of my other colleagues, there are 12 of us that are elected, so 12 sections of criminal district court, we then can also reassess whether a person needs any type of referrals to mental health needs, substance abuse, etc. The main way in which a person gets help through the criminal justice system, unfortunately, is that the court, the district attorney's office, or their defense attorneys, OJ, it could be the public defender's office or a private attorney, has to raise mental competency, or they have to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, excuse me. And so as a result, that person is then evaluated by a sanity commission. We have several doctors that work in connection with the court, psychiatrists and psychologists, that will do evaluations of a particular person. I usually allow time for the defense attorneys or family members to gather medical documents, information about their medical history, because the doctors who are doing the evaluations in court, 9 times out of 10, they do not know the person. And so an evaluation or an interview that takes maybe a half an hour to an hour is not usually sufficient enough. So if the attorneys can tell me that they can gather additional information, if the family is there and they can provide us with additional information, we will assist in trying to get that additional information so the doctors can review everything in the person's history. So they're just not relying on the person to self-report their mental health history. Imagine that. So if the person is found or deemed to be incompetent to proceed to trial, then they're sent to Eastern Louisiana Mental Health System, which is in East Feliciana. So another issue, we don't have any facilities here. We don't have facilities here. The importance, as you all probably already know, the importance of facilities here is that it would involve treatment along with family. A lot of times there are issues that are intermingled in the family, information and history that the family members can provide. But they're in East Feliciana, so there is a distance. They're distance away. Once the person is restored, I'm giving you a really quick summary. Once the person is restored, they're then sent back to court. They're evaluated again, and then we determine if they actually are able to proceed to trial. Sometimes we send them right back because they're not able, and we disagree with the hospital. So that process could go back and forth. 9 times out of 10, most people who come into the criminal justice system do plead. And so what we have, if a person pleads guilty and they are assessed with a mental health issue, is we will refer them to what we call drug court. Now, the interesting thing about drug court is for substance abuse. But several years ago, criminal district court did have a mental health court. However, we lost funding for that mental health court. So what myself and Judge Karen Herman, who also runs the mental health court, had to do is we appealed to Chief Justice Burnett Johnson, who has been very supportive of the court, and we created a proposal for a track 5. We have 4 tracks in drug court. A track 5, which is a co-occurring track, which addresses those with mental health illness as well as substance abuse. So they have to have the combination of the two. They don't have the combination of the two and they just have mental illness, then we do referrals to the FACT team and other agencies while those people are on probation. So those are just sort of how we've tried to work around the confines and the constrictions that we are governed under with respect to the law. In the last year, we had applied with the city to get funding for misdemeanor, those who are convicted of misdemeanors who are in need of mental illness treatment, because what was happening is the system was saying we're not going to treat them unless they commit a felony. So we want them to commit a felony so they can get the treatment that they need. And it was just backwards. And so we appealed to the city to receive funding for a case manager who could then do a screening and assessments and then referrals so that those who were convicted of misdemeanors could get the assistance. And our case managers in both Track 5 as well as the misdemeanor program will help those clients get Medicaid. They will help them get housing. They will work with other case managers at other treatment facilities that are either inpatient or outpatient. They will work with the family members to help them get the skills and the training that they need to deal with their particular clients. And in mental health court or the misdemeanor health court, what we do is we see those clients over and over, but we're mindful that the sanctions cannot be swift and certain. We're mindful that we need to be patient, and we're mindful that the person is in what we would call a recovery, and that there are going to be hiccups, there are going to be issues. It's not a perfect system, but we're working within the system that we have. And so when people say, why is the court, addressing this issue, I say, why not? We can't ignore the fact that most people who come to the criminal justice system have some type of mental illness, mental deficiency, severe mental illness, or some issue that needs to be addressed. And we have that obligation to do that in order to ensure that they get back to the path that they're meant to be on, and in order to ensure that they can live a healthy life. There are many, many family members that come and they say, this is the only time you've really gotten the real assistance and the real help that we need, is because this person is in the criminal justice system. And while not ideal, I certainly think that it's our obligation to do so.
Thank you so much. And actually, Tracy, so you've already partially answered the question that I was going to ask to all of you next. And I just wanted to point out also when Cheryl mentioned about the arson issue. So, and we'll probably get into this in the afternoon panel, but there are a lot of unmeasured costs, unquantifiable costs associated with untreated serious mental illness, and arson, believe it or not, is one of them. It's very common. Property damage, injuries to, physical injuries during domestic abuse disputes, and that sort of things. And those are all things to keep in mind, I think, moving forward, that, when we talk about these costs, that's one that's not quantifiable, but it's still very important to families, and can shatter. I mean, if someone gets in, you can get that one bill that can shatter a family. So, so my question really, and so I have this frustration with we wrap so many resources into the correction system, and once the person's in the correction system, it's a closed loop. It's hard to get out. So correction. So we had the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which was designed to reform our laws so that we could save money in terms of shorter sentences and getting people out sooner, and that we were going to reinvest those savings into helping people from recidivating back to jails and prisons. But that money stays within the correction system. It doesn't leave the correction system. So one of the things, and we'll talk about this in the afternoon, is we started an assisted outpatient treatment program in New Orleans that can intervene in a person's life before they've committed a crime. No charges are needed. But there would be no money from the Justice Reinvestment Initiative savings that can come back to the civil process because it's in the correction system. So my question is, to all of you, and then we'll, when the audience, after this, we'll have the audience come up and you can take either microphone if you have questions, but what do you see as the biggest barrier to implementing a full continuum of care from where you stand, and how do we make that shift, right, from all of the resources that we spend on criminalizing people, and with good, and they're there because we closed down the hospitals, the patients went into the jails, and we all followed them in there. All of our mental health professionals, our doctors, they're keeping their oath, the Hippocratic Oath. They're going to treat people wherever they are as best they can. But we all just followed everybody into the jails. Well, how do we get them back out? Like, where does that intervention begin from your perspective? I'll start with Cecile.
That's a big question.
It's a big question, and you only have 5 minutes.
Well, and unfortunately, the intervention, from my perspective, is that encounter with the police officer, that's where it first starts. And the whole goal of CIT is to divert people away from the emergency rooms and away from jail. But in order to do that, you have to have the resources and the programs to divert people to. I equate it to the cart. I live down in the Miami-Dade, so I see the mules pulling the carts, right? And I keep thinking we keep putting mules out there, but we have no cart. We don't have the resources and we don't have the programs to meet the protocols for wellness. And my co-panel person here said it so well, and I've always been told it needs to be the will of our political leaders to make this happen. And for whatever reason, it has been acceptable that jail was going to be the facility to treat those with chronic mental illness. I'm not quite sure how that happened. And that's the shift really across the country. It's not just here in New Orleans, but across the country that we've gone to, and we've got to reverse that shift and make sure that we have the facilities and the resources for those with chronic mental illness. We're talking about a medical disability, right? And I often in essence, what we have done is we have taken away that wheelchair from those with chronic mental illness. I was watching the trailer for a movie that came out, The Ripple Effect. If you all have seen that, it's a documentary done by Kevin Hines, who was, I think, one of 18 survivors of the Golden Gate Bridge. But in that trailer, he said mental illness and substance abuse are the only medical disabilities in which we blame the person. Primarily, we're dealing with genetics, right? I'm also a family member, so I have a son with mental illness and addiction. And he got the gene. There wasn't anything that he did to himself to be in this situation, but genetically he got it. And as I became a family member, after being an advocate for so long, I kind of thought I would get a hall pass, but it didn't happen. But when it started happening with me, even though I do this as a career, I had no idea what to do. And it was so evident that even our resources for our family members, they're none. There's really no place for us to go to get a roadmap to help our loved one in wellness. And I guess we go back to being at a will of our political leaders. You've done a great job in Miami-Dade.
Well, and I think that one of the things that I want to highlight here is that I agree with you. What are we diverting people to?
Right.
In Miami, we had existing treatments and services, and it was our job then in the court system because no one else could do it or was willing to do it. So it gets back to that political will again. But we need to connect the dots so that we're developing collaborations that make sense. And our Jail InReach project is a perfect example of that. We knew that we wanted to identify and expedite release from jail as quickly as possible, and we had to enlist other stakeholders, partners that had similar goals. Miami-Dade Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation wanted these people out of the jail. So we went to them and said, how can we work together to make the system work faster? How can we identify people and how can we expedite their release? We also spoke to correctional health services. They were already providing an assessment in jail. And we said, how can we speed up that process? So again, we meet a common goal. And then we partnered with the Behavioral Health Authority in the community that was providing the treatments and services for people that were indigent. So I think things existed in my community, and it took our efforts to connect those dots and break down those silos. And it's not always about the money. It's about developing those collaborative relationships to achieve a common goal.
Barksdale, you're taking notes.
Yeah. I guess maybe as a public defender and sort of the guy that gets the, I think someone said frontline view. I'm not optimistic. I'm not. These are not new problems. The first time the quote relating to the jails becoming the new asylums that I could find in doing a little bit of Google research is in 2001, and there's a similar reference in 97. This has been an epidemic for decades, and we all get in a room and we sing from the same song sheet and everyone nods their head and we all agree, but I'm sick of it. I'm sick of complacence, and I'm sick of you. I'm sick of me. I'm sick of being willing to walk past the person on the street who's catching butterflies and screaming and acting like I don't see it, shielding my child's eyes as we walk past them or cross the street. And until enough of us face this, face the reality of this, and demand that our leaders face the reality of this and lead us out of this system, it cannot be fixed. So when you asked what's the biggest barrier to lowering the incarceration of serious mentally ill, I wrote, local alternatives in education, and that is the answer. But that's nonsense, because we're not going to have local alternatives in education. We've been talking about it for decades. It's not going to happen. Something has to happen now. And so, as the realist, pessimist public defender, this is why I put forward the proposal I did to Councilmember Williams. And he asked me, why did you not ask for a public defender mental health unit for the office? Because I had only asked for one for municipal court. And I said, I don't think y'all will fund it. But if you fund this municipal court program, I can save the city money. And saving the city money, I can get their interest, and then I can ask them to support a full office public defender mental health unit that can continue to save them money even on the really scary cases, like felon in possession of a firearm or possession of cocaine, which are just terrifying. And it's so scary that we have to put people in jail with bonds to make sure they're not out in the street. if we can address those issues as the public defender, as the person on the front line, if I can have the capacity to have the caseload to manage and the education to my attorneys and my social workers to help educate the bench and to help push these issues forward, that jail should not be for punishment for people who can't make bond and haven't been found guilty of anything, and that for people with serious mental illness, we have solutions. That's maybe something that's realistic that can be done, that's very, 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 very small, but could start moving towards the type of systemic change that is necessary to actually answer your question. And we can do that, but it demands that the public demand it.
Thank you so much for those wise words. And I guess I tend to be a little more optimistic, but that's why I do what I do, and that's what this is about also. Cindy, you wanted to respond to Barksdale?
Well, yes, I did, because I know that in the development of our jail diversion programs, we had to attend to that political will in the community. And our state attorney, our district attorney, was not going to have it. They are all about public safety. So we had to start small. We had to demonstrate success. And as we demonstrated success, our components expanded, and expanded exponentially, because and we demonstrated that success. And I think that's really important. I think there are solutions, but you have to work together to do it. And also, there are existing resources. We didn't need any funding to start our misdemeanor program, because we did it from our criminal division. There were clerks there. There was a judge there. The public defender and the state attorney were there. Everybody was there. It was just carved out of what was already existing. So I think there are solutions, and sometimes those creative solutions with what already exists makes the difference so that you can demonstrate success.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm going to go to Cheryl and then Tracy and then the audience. But I also wanted to mention that Cindy and a lot of folks here are up here have a lot of expertise in the nuts and bolts of actually building these programs. And so we're having a reception after the conference is over, which is also a networking opportunity, and our speakers will be there. So if you want to get any more information on the actual nuts and bolts of building things, we have experts sitting right here that you can speak with. And Cheryl, I wanted to
Sure. I actually do have hope, and maybe it's because of what we're doing in New York, and it's no accident that we named Hope House. The criminalization of people with mental illness is very much about the deinstitutionalization, but it's also about the last 40 years of drug policy in this country and sentencing laws. And there is a huge movement in this country to reform the criminal justice system on both those points, and also on bail reform. In New York, we just passed a bail reform law, so judges are no longer setting bail on people with misdemeanors. Just even a few years, Rikers in the 1990s held 22,000 people. Today, we're at about 7,000, and it's anticipated that we're going to go down to around 3,000. So I do have hope, and the Greenberger Center actually last year did a landscaping exercise to see what were the major things we could do to decriminalize mental illness, and some of you were gracious enough to participate in our landscaping effort. And time and again, we heard 4 things to change this system. 1 is reform HIPAA. So that loved ones can get the information they need. 2 is to reform the IMD exclusion, institutions of mental disease. Basically, the federal government discriminates against people with mental illness. No other disease is discriminated against. And if you have an institution of mental disease, IMD, of more than 16 beds, you can't get Medicaid. If you have a brain tumor in your head, you're going to get to go to a hospital if you're poor and get that fixed. If you have schizophrenia in your brain, you're going to end up in prison or on the streets. So that needs to be fixed. Standard of commitment. It needs to be changed. We shouldn't be waiting until people are dangerous if they really need help. It's not for everybody, and I don't propose to say that we think everyone should be involuntarily committed. It's a very serious thing, but sometimes it has to happen. In New York, we just had 4 homeless people killed by a man who was himself homeless and had mental illness, and his parents tried or his mother tried to get him help and couldn't. So, and a lot of you here have had this story play out. The last thing, and I think most importantly, is housing. We need to have more fountain houses. We need to have, with supportive housing connected to the clubhouse, we need to have different alternatives to incarceration that are first and foremost about housing, because what studies have shown is that it's the social determinants that are more important than even the medication. So if someone is off medication but has a roof over their head and has some kind of employment or something, some support, they're going to do better than someone who's just on medication and maybe on the streets or incarcerated. So I'm hopeful. I think this is the time. If we don't take charge right now, and if we don't get our SMI population the help they need now, we're not going to get it. And the answer is not to create new jails, like I said before, for the SMI population.
So for me, I always start further back, I think, than most. I start with the education system with our children. Every time I get an opportunity to speak to anyone who comes down to say, what do you need? What grants can we help with, et cetera, I talk about our children, not about the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system. I talk about when the children first start school. They're in the schools 8 hours, 9 hours a day. The children are dealing with either their own mental health issues or mental illness issues. They're dealing with trauma from domestic violence situations, from substance abuse situations, or it could be genetic. They're dealing with adult issues. They're dealing with parents who are also dealing with mental health issues, substance abuse, economic issues, socioeconomic issues. And we have a educational system that just says teach. And so our teachers, like our judges or like our attorneys or like our advocates, have to wear multiple hats without the training or the necessary funding and resources that they need to really address the issues. So we will be talking about these same issues in 10 years. We will be talking about these same issues in 20 years if we don't address the families and the children in the school systems. When they get to school, when someone recognizes there needs to be a full array of services brought to that child and family, not as a sanction, not through DCFS, not as a punishment, but as support. And I have a lot of friends in the education system, and there is one psychologist or one counselor for 3 or 4 schools. Mm-hmm. So if we start to address then at that point and that level, we don't have people growing up without the necessary care that they need in terms to address life skills, mental illness, substance abuse, coping, trauma, grief, all of the issues that children grow into adults to be, and then their children are dealing with the same issues that they are dealing with. And so that's first, is that addressing it in the educational system. And I'm going to say this, I don't mean any offense to politicians, because I have a lot of friends in the political world who are working very hard to try to do the right thing, but children don't vote, and they don't contribute to campaigns. And so while we love children, and while we say we love children and we want to do the right thing for children, we spend way more money in the criminal justice system with jails that are populated by contractors and vendors who make a lot of money, as opposed to our educational system, where our teachers, I just saw something yesterday, our teachers are starting out at $40,000 a year to do all of the things that they have to do for our children. So that's the first thing. Then secondly is we have a wealth of experts around the country, and we have a wealth of experts locally here in New Orleans. There is no reason why we could not have a facility here locally that starts out with inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, and then residential, treatment for those who were then placed in their own apartments or their own living situations with family members where they have case managers or life coaches well before any offense is committed. Because we know the signs, we know the symptoms. Every family member that has come to court on any defendant has always said this behavior existed prior to this offense or prior to their first introduction into the system. So we can address those issues and help those in need long before they get to the system if we have the boots on the ground, right? And then for those that unfortunately, that next group of people, so we didn't get that person when they were in school, right? We didn't get the student or the family. Maybe we didn't get them before they were introduced into the criminal justice system. For those few people that would then be introduced into the criminal justice system, we have a way to divert. Because most of the time when they come into the criminal justice system, they're coming in on very low-level misdemeanor offenses that then escalate over time because they're frustrated by the system. They become desensitized through the systematic process of being incarcerated and not treated, more paranoid, more distrusting, and as they grow older, the symptoms get worse. And so we can address those that come into the system initially. So we can start, we have enough very smart, very knowledgeable people. We have enough agencies, as you said, to get together at the table to collaborate. We need a building, and we need some funding for the people to be at the facility locally. Mm-hmm. And until we get that, then we can't do anything to address that population locally. We're going to keep going in and out of the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system. When I was in juvenile court, I had one young man who was he had been charged with a very serious crime. I placed him at East Feliciana, and he was there, and they would come, the doctors, and they would come and say, he's just got a behavioral issue. And so we need him out because he's causing issues with our other clients. Well, I don't expect him to be perfect. I mean, that's not what it's for. He wouldn't be there if his conduct was otherwise perfect. And so the doctors were coming, the nurses were coming, and I kept him there for years, basically, against their advice. And eventually, when he aged out, he pled, he went on probation, he aged out. And no sooner than I got to criminal court,
There he was.
who do I see walking in? This same young man in orange and in handcuffs. And his thing was, "Hi, Judge Davillier, how are you?" And again, we had to go through this same system.
The system.
Because it was sort of a revolving door. And I think East Feliciana, they do a great job. I don't want to criticize. They do a really good job with what they have. But they also need more resources. And so until we address the real issues in terms of how do we prohibit someone from even getting into the system, we're going to still be talking about this 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now.
Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to invite the audience to come up and ask any questions that you may have. And just out of curiosity, how many in the audience right now have a loved one with serious mental illness who is incarcerated or has been incarcerated at some point in their life? So, and a really stunning statistic, I think, is, while only 4% of people living in America have a serious mental illness, the statistics for those who are incarcerated is somewhere around, varies from 15 to 20%. That's a huge overrepresentation of people with serious mental illnesses who are incarcerated. Eileen, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much.
And say where you're from.
I'm Eileen Wells. I'm from New York. My brother spent 20 years in state mental hospital system, starting in 1976. He is one of the rare, persistently and seriously mental ill schizophrenic people who was never homeless and never incarcerated. And that is because he was committed in 1977, when that was possible. And they saw people as having an illness, not as having a behavioral problem. Paul was seen as a seriously ill person at the time, and we have to get back to that. It is a whole mindset change. I would love to erase behavioral health from our whole lexicon. I wish that term was never invented. It is a brain disorder. We should have brain disorder facilities, not behavioral health facilities. That is the criminalization of people with serious mental illness, behavioral health, right then and there. The other thing that I'd like your panel, this panel here specifically in the criminal justice system, which my brother Paul thankfully was never in, how to address anosognosia, lack of insight, because AOT is the only law, in a sense, that addresses that. Our health providers don't, it's not even acknowledged. I think that is the crux of every problem that we have, is lack of insight and how to address it and how to get that person into care. Cheryl, you brought up the fact that people volunteer into Hope House. Well, Paul didn't have an illness. He wouldn't have never volunteered for anything.
Greenberger either would not admit.
So we really need to address anosognosia within the whole mental health system, and to prevent them getting into the criminal justice system. But how do you address it within the criminal justice system itself?
So that issue of
AOT?
so the issue of anosognosia, does anybody want to take that question?
I would like to address what you said, because I believe that you're so right on. I've been in this playground for 35 years, haven't seen a whole lot. If anything, I've seen less. We had NOLA closed, and I knew when our New Orleans Adolescent Hospital closed that baby jail would end up being where they would end up, which is exactly what's now happened. But I have always said that what I have seen is that this still is not accepted in the medical community as one of theirs. And I think back on people with epilepsy, right? And there was that time when people with epilepsy were shackled and viewed as being demonic. And at some point, the medical community accepted epilepsy as one of theirs, and everything changed. I went cuckoo when they changed the name to behavioral health, because I'm like, to me, that separated this even farther away from where it needs to be, which is the medical community, right? So I appreciate so much what you say. And with our judge, you know, the issue is, let's get the building.
Right.
Let's just get the building, right? There are buildings there. There was one that I looked at, the old Sarah Mayo, that I almost was able to get.
Yeah, there's one right down.
The buildings are good.
Charity Hospital.
I happen to know of a
Charity
building.
hospital is a pretty important.
And I think about, you know, when we talk about our familiar faces, I mean, we have people that we pick up 50, 60 times in 1 year, and there is zero return for that individual.
Exactly.
Zero return. And the amount of money that we are spending, we may have 4 officers out on this call for several hours, right? One person, 50 times he was picked up last year, and I estimated that was over $2 million we spent on one person with zero return for him.
And that is key. And in the interest of time, if you wouldn't mind keeping your questions short, we're going to get to everybody. We may go a little over, but if you don't mind, it'll cut into lunch. But I think, you know, as long as it's okay with the audience, you know, we'll shorten the lunch by 10 or 15 minutes. Sherry?
Hi, Sherry McJimsey from North Carolina. I want to address you. I just came from a meeting last week. In North Carolina, there are 3 pilot schools that are doing the AWARE program that is asking exactly what you want in your schools here. AWARE, yes. SAMHSA just gave them a huge grant, and it's in 3 rural areas in North Carolina, and it's exactly what you were asking for your schools.
Thank you.
I need to ask, how long do y'all have to, someone has to be in a jail before they're assessed? Because we fought from 30 days to 15 in North Carolina
Barksdale, probably you.
for mental illness.
So our assessment process is very opaque to understand how the jail does it, if at all. If it's self-declared, a person comes in and says, I take medications, then they usually get flagged. We recently shifted to Tulane Psychiatric subcontracting, and that seems to have increased the number of identifications. A lot of times, though, it comes from an attorney's raising it, as the judge said earlier, for raising competency or not guilty for raising insanity. And one of the chief problems for me and why we need a mental health unit and why we need to have training in this area is the number of times I'm called to a trial in the middle of it by an attorney who's frantic, who's like, I don't understand. They've offered the deal that he needs to take, and he just can't say yes, and he won't give me any reason. And I talked to the man for 5 minutes, and I'm like, okay, well, he can't say yes because his IQ is 50, and he said yes all the time to you and pleased you because that's part of having an IQ of 50, and he has no understanding of what's happening, and you should have raised competency 7 months ago, but now we need to do it in the middle of the trial, and that is not popular with the judges and with the DA and with the system, as it's a poorly timed to do it, but you got to, and then they're found incompetent, and then often irrestorable. We're not trained to be doctors. I have never once received in my legal training a single hour of education on identifying mental illness. I'm not trained in that in law school, and I've only, because I've sought it out personally, been able to train myself and go to trainings for that purpose. So, the screening is very poor. It's opaque. We don't know. We do know 50% of our inmate population suffers from mental illness, approximately 15% serious mental illness. I think it's quite higher than that because I think that is the amount that is reported, and I don't believe we're doing adequate screening to identify those who don't self-report.
And in
And
court,
I-
we have,
oh,
just in
sorry.
court, real quick, just in court, we have psychiatrists and psychologists that we work with. And so on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they're there to do mental health evaluations. They do them right in court. And as I said earlier, if there's additional documentation that can be provided by the family or by the attorneys, then that means, you wait till the next Tuesday or Thursday or until the information can be gathered and provided to the doctors. But we do have these ongoing relationships with these doctors. And then if they are placed in any type of program, our drug court program with our Track 5, we actually have psychologists and psychiatrists that we contract with as well who can provide that sort of continuum of care. But if they are trying to get services through, say, Metropolitan Human Services District, which is a great agency, but they just don't have the resources, it might take a month or 2 months to get an appointment. And so a lot of times what we, like just a week or so ago, we will call court and we will call Metropolitan or we will call an agency and say we need an appointment ASAP because we can see the person deteriorating in court.
Okay, so I need to
Yeah,
answer this question.
in contrast, Miami-Dade.
Our jail is under a consent decree with the Department of Justice, and they were ordered to improve the treatment and services for people that had mental illnesses in the jail. To date, we have 55% of our jail has inmates that have been identified with mental illnesses. But our jail diversion program is serving people with serious mental illnesses. If a person is booked into the jail, we have centralized booking, the screening process begins there. If they're identified with a serious mental illness, they will get an assessment in booking and by a mental health professional. If they are determined to have a mental illness, they would be classified to the behavioral health units in the jail. If you're on level 1 or 2, those are the most serious acute disorders or suicide watch, you will have a psychiatric assessment within 24 hours.
24 hours.
24 hours.
That's wonderful.
Before the consent decree, there were, for a jail population of 7,000 people, there were maybe 3 psychiatrists. Now, with the consent decree, there's more than 20.
We have about 5 minutes left. We'll take as many questions as we can. Judge Reese?
Thanks, Janet. Appreciate that. I wanted to say 2 things. One observation. I think that, my name is Kern Reese, by the way. I'm from New Orleans. I'm a judge here, and I'm affiliated with the AOT court. In terms of convincing decision makers as to why we need to reallocate resources to mental health service, two reasons. One, it's the right thing to do, and the second thing, it saves money. Cindy, I'd like to direct my question to you, and please give Judge Leifman my best regards, because I really admire him a great deal. I saw a film on Metro-Dade's 8th floor, I believe, of the jail.
It's called the 9th floor.
9th floor, excuse me, one floor down, one floor up, rather. And to call it medieval is to pay it a compliment at the time in the early 2000s, before it was reformed. And there has been a reallocation of resources in Metro-Dade. If you would comment on how the reallocation of your resources has impacted the population, reallocation of how much resources has been reallocated to treating the mentally ill rather than incarcerating, I think that would be beneficial, if you would.
The story of the 9th floor was truly horrific. You would never have even put your pet on the 9th floor. But that was more than 10 years ago. And you can Google it now, and you can see the update to the 9th floor. And you see that the 9th floor was closed. The behavioral health units were moved to another jail location. Huge improvements have been made. And again, it's these collaborations that have made the world of difference. Also, just as an aside, those changes got made. But Judge Leifman was able to shine a light on those horrific conditions and then again on the improvements by using the media. The 9th floor was that whole series of videos was on the nightly news. Yeah. And he had a relationship with the reporter. He has a relationship with people on the Miami Herald. He has a relationship with news media all over the state of Florida and really all over the nation. So he used those relationships to shine a light on this whole issue. And it's made a huge difference for all of us across the nation. In regards to the reallocation, this whole highlighting of this issue is very important and has come to the forefront in our community with our county commissioners, with our mayor. We're in the process of developing the Miami Center for Mental Health and Recovery, which will be a one-stop shop for police to drop off people that are high utilizers for police, the emergency rooms, and will also house treatments and services. Our community has come to realize that this is a more productive solution and creative solution than housing people in jail. Our goal is to identify people with serious mental illnesses and expedite their release and diversion to community-based treatments and services. I think education is also the key. We try to educate anyone that will listen, and that means the court system, the public defender, the state attorney, the mental health providers, family, anyone that wants to partner with us, we partner, and we are inclusive. No one gets blamed. Let's develop a whole new system. Let's transform the system of care to include the people that need it the most. So I'm not sure that I answered your question about reallocation, but it's something that we work on every single day. I just want to take 2 seconds to tell you also that there are challenges every day. We have state funding that are called incidental funds to help people get housing, medication, and treatments. In this past year, we were told that our program was over-enrolled. And I was told that I was a poor manager because I over-enrolled too many people. And last night you talked about where's the thin line where one day you say, I've had enough. And that was almost it for me. But I believe that I can change the system of care. And it's helpful to have a champion in my corner. And that champion is Judge Steve Leifman.
Thank you. And for more information, you can check out the Miami-Dade Mental Health Project, which is held up as a national model that many communities, states, organizations are adopting and it's proliferating, pollinating around the country. Tucker, and I guess we're going to have a half-hour lunch instead of an hour lunch. So we'll start lunch at 12:30. Tucker, go ahead.
Sorry for biting into your lunch hour, everybody.
No, please, no.
My name is Tucker Keatley. I'm a social worker here in Louisiana, working with Quartet Health. This is the time of year where 6 years ago I was in between diagnosis and hospitalization for bipolar disorder. And I don't count myself any small miracle to not be ever involved in the incarceration, being incarcerated or in the criminal justice system. And however, with all the privileges I have, I really noted a lot of the talk about blame earlier. Dr. Thompson mentioned it, Ms. Cecile, ma'am, you just did too. And the criminal justice system is inherently supposed to attribute blame. Last year there was a Massachusetts Supreme Court case that had decided that relapsing during probation did not mean that that person could avoid going back to jail. And with a lot of these diversion programs requiring progress or patients to meet these requirements to sustain well-being and stay out of the criminal justice system, being incarcerated, a lot of that relies on possibly unreasonable expectations on the patient, whether it's drug court, mental health court, or co-occurring court. And I wanted to ask, these are incremental changes, and some of these are quite great and amazing, but they're still relying on unexpected or unreasonable expectations that inherently place the blame on the person and not on the system. So I'm just curious to hear what y'all's thoughts are on where that blame is attributed and how that can be reframed from the patient or the offender to the system that pushes that person back into jail.
Cheryl, do you want to take that one?
Just quickly, when we developed the Hope House model, we asked psychiatrists for this SMI population with higher level felony charges, what is the time frame that you think is necessary to treat them? Is it 6 months, 9 months, 30 days? They said, no, it's a year, probably, maybe 18 months, at the outside 2 years. So we have said Hope House is for people for up to 2 years. And of course, if they're not ready, we'll have to have that conversation. But it's required conversation with Medicaid. And we are really in the throes of that because it's unfortunately Medicaid and money drive length of stay, not what you're talking about, and we have to change that. And so we're going to be a small pot, 32 people, but if we can show that in the end, a few more months actually stabilizes and will save everyone time and money, then that's, I think, a place to start.
And in court, we have a lot of those clients that are in drug court, they are there for several years. They move through certain phases in drug court, and then with the co-occurring track, they move through what we call benchmarks. And so understanding that mindset of there are going to be relapses, so we have relapse recovery. There are going to be various issues that they're confronted with that will trigger them to maybe use or trigger them to do something. We have all of our staffings, it's always with the case manager and a treatment counselor so that we can understand why the behavior is such that it is, because there is some issue that has maybe triggered when they were doing fine, they were clean, whatever, there was some issue that maybe triggered something for them. And so then there's referrals to trauma counseling or grief counseling, or it could be that they need inpatient treatment. It could be housing. They become homeless all of a sudden, or they were homeless. So we have just, I think, a myriad of services that are trying to work with and identify what issues and how do we actually treat those issues that are triggers for the mental health illness, or triggers for them to then, I guess, cope in different ways, different than what we are trained to cope or how we are trained to cope. So some people turn back to, substance abuse or some alcohol or something else. But all of the judges that are drug court judges, and it's not a perfect system, but we all go to training. And that's part of it, is that it is no longer looking at it from a probation standpoint. We're looking at it from a treatment standpoint, which is why we rely heavily on our case managers and our treatment counselors for advice, recommendations as to what to do, as opposed to relying on the law enforcement way, or probation or sanctions. Those are possible sanctions, but we try to use them in less as an alternative than what else can we do to try to help this client and their family.
I would also just recommend that if you're interested in this issue, a qualitative report came out in August from the University of Illinois at Chicago called Professional Interaction in Mental Health Court, Processing Defendants with Mental Illness. And I think that it's an extremely insightful piece of reporting and noticing what the issues inherent in the current model of mental health court. Now, we don't have mental health court. We have Track 5, as was explained. So only co-occurring disorders can be addressed. But even in broader mental health courts, you still have real concerns about autonomy of the individual involvement and getting buy-in from the individual, because many, as the judge just said, interactions occur in the back room between the counselors and the probation officers explaining the issues, and then a judgment is rendered and explained to the individual rather than them being involved in their care and treatment. And this is especially compounded by the amount of screening that goes into mental health court acceptability. So there's a lot of screening on the front end that almost invariably throws out anyone with serious mental illness, only relying on people who are likely to be successful, and then in that population, whenever there's an issue, relying on sanctions such as incarceration, which is actually physically dangerous for a relapse of a benzodiazepine relapse. You put them in jail, they're going to die. And that's not well known and understood. Similar, opiate concerns for withdrawal, they're more understood than the benzo alcohol problem, but that's not something that lawyers are trained in, and more education is needed, and but don't let the perfect be the enemy of good.
Right. Nothing like a jail cell to trigger a schizophrenic or psychotic episode.
Yeah. And
Well
I'd just
said.
like to say that our staff serve as supports to the people that are voluntarily in our program, and our case managers hold the case managers that are in the community accountable, and our peer specialists work along with our participants as navigators to the mental health system, the court system, and any other system that they need to get assistance from.
And I just want to address, because you talked about the diversion, and I was thinking back, my son's first arrest was when he was 21, and he was offered diversion, and it ended up costing us, as his family, over $60,000.
Oh, my.
And so I think about that, right? And again, he's one of the fortunate ones, right? Because with this diversion, but it was sort of like he was offered diversion and then just kind of left alone. And we used it as an opportunity, and we ended up having to send him to a facility in North Carolina because there simply weren't the services here. And this is because diversion is big now, right? There's you'll hear a lot of talk about diversion, and I'm like, okay, but what are they being diverted to? Right? Who's going to have, we're over $600,000 in treatment for this child of ours, right? He's one of the 11% who get access to treatment. Only 11% get access to treatment. And we're talking a huge number of folks that are affected. So there's still, we're moving with diversion, but we still don't have the building. Can we have this building?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions, so we need to get going with the next part of our program. However, we will be here all day, and there will be plenty of time to discussion this afternoon. I just also want to point out one remarkable thing about Miami-Dade. Florida is not a Medicaid expansion state, yet Judge Leifman, with the help of Cindy and their peers and all of the people involved in the program, have created a national model that so many of us are looking to for guidance. So please, everybody, thank our panelists. I'm going to ask DJ to come up.